But now I'd like you all to help me welcome Philip Ewell.
Thanks, Betsy, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm also going to be the tech person at my computer here as I switch between these presentations. And a quick sound check. Okay. You can see from this slide that there is a PDF and a bibliography at my website. If you're interested, philipewell.com, then go to Research and Presentations. I thought there would be one big screen behind me and I could go like this to show something at the screen. I can't do that. So if I do something like this, just think that you might want to look at the slide at that point.
Sometimes it's like, I notice when you're talking to white people and you say the word white, it's almost like you just stabbed them a little bit in the stomach every time you say it. I mean, but you don't have to be saying something crazy. Like you could just be saying a white person ate his cereal. It's like a white person hugged his mother. It's like, it just, each time it's like, you just see them like, you know, kind of flinch a little bit. So I don't, like, what is that?
Yeah, I just flinched twice.
Music theory is white. According to SMT, roughly 84% of the society's membership, 90% of full-time employees, and 94% of associate and full professors are white. Aside from this literal version, there's an even more deep-seated figurative whiteness that manifests itself in the composers and music theorists we choose to study. Thus, for example, I'm a black person, the only associate professor who self-identified as such in the SMT demographic report, but I'm also a practitioner of what I sometimes call white music theory. In 1995, SMT formed the Diversity Committee to increase the ethnic diversity of the membership of the society. In 1996, President Joe Strauss set the goal to diversify our membership, noting that of current members, fewer than 2% are African American or Hispanic. In 2018, that number had increased to only 2.9%. Thus, for over 22 years, SMT has tried to increase racial diversity by, for example, forming committees to address demographic issues, providing grant monies targeting racial minorities, and instituting programs for mentoring persons of color. Despite our efforts, we have failed. Today, I argue for a fundamentally different approach to music theory's literal and figurative whiteness. I draw on the anti-racist work of race scholars and concepts like the white racial frame, racialized structures, and colorblind racism. I ultimately argue for a restructuring of our racialized structures, a deframing and reframing of the white racial frame in hopes of achieving true racial diversity. In various works, sociologist Joe Fagan explains how a white racial frame has emerged in the United States that was generated to rationalize and ensure white privilege and dominance over Americans of color. I posit that this white racial frame is very much active today in music theory. Here's his definition for the white racial frame. With respect to music theory, I stress not so much negative non-white racial stereotypes as positive white stereotypes, or as Fagan calls it, a pro-white subframe, which is fundamental to music theory and which also spurs a racialized inclination to discriminate. Perhaps the most important role in this framing is to keep the system as it is. Fagan says, one function of the white frame is to justify the great array of privileges and assets held by white Americans as the group at the top of the racial hierarchy. White persons have held all the power in music theory. Music theory's white racial frame entrenches and institutionalizes that power. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva defines a racial structure as the totality of the social relations and practices that reinforce white privilege. Many of our music theoretical institutions are, in fact, such racialized structures. The final important term from Bonilla Silva for today is colorblind racism, the most significant form of racism in our white racial frame. "What does music theory have to do with race?" has been a common music theoretical colorblind refrain, which accomplishes two goals. It allows the white frame theorist to appear to be on the correct side of racism while allowing the very same racialized structures put in place to benefit members of the dominant white race to remain foundational. Also note the avoidance of racial terminology, especially the terms white and whiteness, which has been a primary driver behind the neoliberal language of diversity, which I will touch on briefly later. In order to debunk the many mythologies of music theory's white racial frame, we must confront its core beliefs head on. Our white racial frame believes that the music and music theories of white persons represent the best framework for music theory. Among these white persons, the music and music theories of whites from German-speaking lands of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries represent the pinnacle of music theoretical thought. The institutions and structures of music theory have little or nothing to do with race or whiteness, and that to critically examine race and whiteness in music theory would be unfair or inappropriate. The language of diversity and the actions it affects will rectify racial disparities and therefore racial injustices in music theory. I analyzed the 7 most widely used theory textbooks in the United States in order to cull racial data on the composers represented and the market share of the textbooks. Overwhelmingly, the music chosen to represent music theory was written by white persons. Of 2,930 musical examples in all 7 textbooks, 49 were written by non-whites. This represents 1.67% of the musical examples from all textbooks, which account for roughly 96% of the market share. By comparison, once we realized that there were virtually no female composers in our music theory textbooks, we began to include them. Similarly, the first solution we will think of to solving this racial imbalance will be to find examples by black composers. But stocking our textbooks with such examples is not the solution to this problem, which is a result of framing Western functional tonality as the only organizational force in music worthy of music theory's consideration in the classroom. As the main musical organizational force that emerged from Europe in the 17th through 19th centuries, functional tonality is also racialized as white and a key element of Bonilla Silva's racial structure, which again is the totality of social relations and practices that reinforce white privilege. Thus, our curricular problem concerns not only the repertoire we study, but the music theories behind the repertoire. This distinction between white repertoire and white theory is of vital importance since our white frame can only envision one, that is, expanding the repertoire to include non-white composers, and not the other, studying non-Western, non-white music theory. Lest you think I somehow wish to implicate only whiteness, I'd like to mention a person of color who was more committed to white racial framing than anyone I know. My father, John Ewell, who died in 2007. John only valued the West, and he often disparaged non-Western cultures and societies. John, who graduated Morehouse College in 1948 with Martin Luther King, ultimately got a PhD in number theory from UCLA as an advisee of Ernst Strauss, himself a former advisee and assistant of Albert Einstein. John's heroes were mathematicians such as Euler, Gauss, Fermat, or composers such as Mozart, Verdi, Rachmaninoff. John raised me to worship Western cultures, their arts, music, languages, philosophies. Though at a fairly early age, I knew his beliefs were suspect. I include the story about my father only to highlight just how pervasive white racial framing is. I know with certainty that my black father would have vehemently denied that his beliefs could have in any way been associated with the white supremacy that inheres in America's white racial frame. Much to my disappointment, he was wrong. The best example through which to understand our white frame is Heinrich Schenker, a fervent racist whose racism undoubtedly influenced his music theories, yet gets whitewashed for general consumption. It would be hard to overstate Heinrich Schenker's influence on American music theory. Whether one specifically studies Schenker and Schenkerian analysis, tonal music generally, popular music, or post-tonal topics, Schenker in many ways represents our shared model of what it means to be a music theorist. If Beethoven is our exemplar for a music composer, Schenker is our exemplar for a music theorist. After all, his is the only named music theory uniformly required across top music theory graduate programs. In his voluminous writings, Schenker often mentions race and the terms white and black as modifiers for human races. He speaks of less able or more primitive races, inferior races, and wild and half-wild peoples. He speaks of whiteness in relation to the animal Japanese, that the white race will need to adapt in order to annihilate the Japanese animals. On Slavs, Schenker poured more scorn, writing about the Slavic half-breed, that the Germans must crush them on grounds of superiority. About blacks, Schenker had the lowest of opinions. When speaking about self-governance, Schenker says, in disbelief, even Negroes proclaim that they want to govern themselves because they too can achieve it. Schenker disparages the music of blacks, especially Negro spirituals, claiming that they were completely falsified, dishonest expropriation of European music. It seems Schenker liked these spirituals since he compared them to European music. But instead of according blacks a measure of artistic integrity, he reduces the genre to thievery, stripping it of its humanity, which in turn reflects his hatred of blackness. After World War I, Schenker laments that Germany must endure the ignominy of France's Senegalese black troops, the advance party of its genitals, of the flesh of its flesh, of the cannibal spirit of its spirit. Note here Schenker's homoerotic objectivization and fetishization of the black male body, a common dehumanizing tactic of the so-called biological race science of the 19th and 20th centuries. One point roundly disregarded in Schenker's studies concerns his views against racial mixing. Yet there can be no doubt that he disapproved of this mixing, which figured prominently in biological race science. Schenker says, race is good. Inbreeding of race, however, is murky. Schenker expressed horror at the mixing of races in Senegalese marriage relationships and intermarrying black racial stock with a French mother. This is paramount because white racial frame authors, on the rare occasion that they deal with this topic, have generally called Schenker's racism cultural and not biological, because linking Schenker to biological racism would ally him with eugenics, which would undoubtedly harm the promotion of his music theories. In other words, by calling Schenker's racism cultural instead of what it was, biological, our white racial frame seeks to shield Schenker from unwanted criticism. Schenker's racism presented a problem for those who promoted his work. To solve this problem, his offensive writings were either removed or whitewashed for general consumption. Joe Fagan says, the dominant racial frame has sharply defined inferior and superior racial groups and authoritatively rationalized and structured the great and continuing racial inequalities of this American society. In a whitewashing process, this dominant framing has shoved aside, ignored, or treated as incidental numerous racial issues, including the realities of persisting racial discrimination and racial inequality. This is precisely what has happened with Schenker in our white racial frame. On this slide, I have listed 6 clear instances in which our white frame has shoved aside, ignored, or treated as incidental Schenker's racism, stating that it has no bearing on his music theories, that it can be disregarded or omitted, that his supposed indiscretions were just peripheral ramblings. William Benjamin, citing Schenker's apparent racism, even implies that not only was Schenker not racist, he was actually a closet egalitarian. While Nicholas Cook says that perhaps Schenker was only joking when he wrote the repugnant things he wrote. Indeed, the only thing that has been completely off the table in our white racial frame is simply calling Schenker the virulent racist he was. In a seventh instance of sanitizing Schenker's racism, in the preface to Schenker's Counterpoint, John Rothgeb says, "We urge the reader to recognize that however much Schenker may have regarded his musical precepts as an integral part of a unified worldview, they are, in fact, not at all logically dependent on any of his extra-musical speculations." Here, Rothgeb is saying that not only was Schenker himself incorrect when he expressed that his racist speculations were key to his musical precepts, Rothgeb is actually implying that it would be inappropriate or unfair to examine race in Schenker's theories. Finally, in an eighth example of whitewashing Schenker among countless others, Nicholas Cook says that it would be unhelpful to make the obvious parallel between Schenker's theories on music and his theories on race. What Cook means to say here is that it would be unhelpful to music theory's white racial frame, insofar as it would call attention to race and whiteness. I wish to recouple this severed link between Schenker's beliefs about music and his beliefs about people. Ironically, the person who would most agree with this recoupling is Heinrich Schenker himself, who often spoke of how his unified worldview should be considered a whole. Ultimately, our white racial frame's removal and denial of race in the study of Schenker and his musical theories is a textbook example of colorblind racism. When reading Schenker's music theoretical works anew from a critical race perspective, it's actually quite easy to see his racism in his music theories. As with the inequality of races, Schenker believed in the inequality of tones. For example, compare the following two passages, one concerning people, the other music. Here we begin to see how Schenker's racism pervaded his music theories. In short, neither racial classes nor pitch classes were equal in Schenker's theories, and he uses the same language to express these beliefs. As I said earlier, Schenker did not believe blacks were capable of self-governance. Since he wrote this in 1922, when virtually all of Africa was under white colonial rule, his sentiment is clear: blacks must be controlled by whites. Similarly, Schenker believed notes from the fundamental structure must control other notes, as the quote on the right of the slide shows. I've only scratched the surface in showing how Schenker's racism permeates his music theories, but this may actually be less important than how we present Schenker's work in the classroom. Philosopher Laurie Schrage makes an analogous point when speaking about her field's anti-Semitism. When the anti-Semitic views of great thinkers such as Kant, Voltaire, or Hume, or Hegel, Schopenhauer, Heidegger, and Wittgenstein for that matter, are exposed, one typical response is to question whether these prejudices are integral to their important works and ideas. But this may be the wrong question. A better question is, should those who teach their works and ideas in the 21st century share them without mentioning the harmful stereotypes these thinkers helped to legitimize? Hear, hear. Clearly, philosophers have whitewashed the anti-Semitism of their important figures much the same way we have whitewashed Schenker's racism. At a minimum, we must present Schenker's work to our students in full view of his racist beliefs and let them decide what to do with that information. Like philosophy's anti-Semitism, the study of Schenker and his music theories has helped to legitimize harmful stereotypes about blacks and other people of color. We music theorists can no longer ignore that simple fact. Another danger to music theory is to be uncritical of the pervasive language of diversity, which Sarah Ahmed describes as a managerial neoliberal term. In certain circumstances, she says that the term diversity is a sign of the lack of commitment to change and might even allow organizations such as universities to conceal the operation of systematic inequalities. To a large extent, the language of diversity, which often actually reinforces our white racial frame, exists to avoid one simple concept: whiteness. Indeed, one of the main goals of our white racial frame is to take the focus off of whiteness. Yet only through directly confronting whiteness will we begin to see real change with respect to the racial makeup of music theory. In a satirical piece, How Can I Help to Promote Diversity Without Relinquishing Any of My Power?, comedian Chandler Dean lays bare our dilemma. Nice to see you. I'm an ally. As an upper middle class, Northeastern American, liberal, college-educated, cis-straight white male, I'm aware of my privilege. And I'm willing to do anything to fight for progress, especially if it involves me telling you how aware of my privilege I am. So, make no mistake, I will do anything to uplift the marginalized, as long as uplifting the marginalized doesn't involve diminishing my societal position in any fashion. That would, of course, be unfair. Implicit in Dean's satire is our true challenge, that we must accept a measure of a diminishing societal position, cede some music theoretical territory to non-Western, non-white music theories in the academy, and make structural anti-racist changes in our field. It is relatively easy to form a committee or task force to discuss diversity, but harder to reduce a 4-semester undergraduate music theory sequence that focuses solely on Western theory to a 2-semester sequence, clearing a path for 2 new semesters of non-Western, non-white music theory core classes. Easy, relatively, to award grant monies to racial minorities to attend conferences, yet harder to scrap the German language requirement, which is racist, obviously, in music theory graduate programs. Easy, relatively, to institute a mentoring program for people of color in music theory, but harder to concede that Schenker's racism, which our white racial frame has whitewashed for nearly 100 years, deeply suffused his music theories, and that we are obligated as educators to present Schenker's racism alongside his music theories, as Schenker himself would have wanted. For my entire career, I have been firmly ensconced in our white racial frame, a figurative white music theorist. But I am now conflicted. For to feed, sustain, and promote a system based on racialized structures and institutions is simply unacceptable in 2019. Is this our #MusicTheorySoWhite moment? I certainly hope so, which is to say, I hope that we can show the fortitude to face these inconvenient truths and change music theory for the better in the future. Thank you.